Have you ever been in a place where you felt invisible, like no matter how much you belonged, the world refused to see you? Imagine stepping into a first-class cabin, dressed with quiet confidence, carrying the right ticket in hand, only to be ignored, dismissed, and treated as if you didn't deserve to be there. What would you do in that moment? Would you lower your head and shrink into silence, or would you stand tall and remind them who you really are? This is not just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about dignity tested in the sky, about a woman forced to decide between letting prejudice define her or showing the world the power she had carried all along. Now pause for a second. If it were you, if the world doubted your worth, how would you respond? Would you stay silent or claim your rightful place? Stay with me, because what happens next will not only shock everyone on that plane, but may also make you look at your own life differently. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter. Naomi Ellison never liked to make an entrance. That morning in Atlanta, she dressed as she often did on days she traveled alone, navy slacks, a cream cardigan, hair tied back in a simple bun, no jewelry, no power suit, no hint of the influence she carried. To the people rushing through Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, she looked like any other middle-aged woman catching a flight north. She preferred it that way. When you were the CEO of Orion Airways, every smile and every frown in the terminal could turn into a headline. Going incognito wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. But as she approached gate C-24 boarding pass in hand, she caught the first sideways glance. A tall man in a gray suit shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other, looked at her, then at the boarding group sign, then back at her again as if the math didn't add up. Naomi stepped into the first-class lane. The gate agent, a young woman with perfect hair and a plastic smile, scanned the pass without a word. The beep confirmed the scan, but the agent's eyes narrowed, just slightly. It was a look Naomi knew too well, a silent question, the kind that said, "Really you?" She answered with the smallest of smiles and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the hush of first class wrapped around her. Leather seats gleamed under soft lighting, champagne glasses already perched on silver trays. Most passengers had the look of frequent flyersmen in tailored jackets, women balancing designer handbags on their laps. Naomi placed her carry-on in the overhead bin above seat 3A. She adjusted it carefully, the way her father, Samuel, had once taught her. Treat every piece of equipment like it matters. He used to say, "Excuse me." A voice cut in. Naomi turned. The man in the gray suit stood behind her. Richard Halbrook, she would later learn, a corporate attorney from Chicago. He pointed to the overhead. "That bin is reserved for our row," he said. Naomi glanced at the empty space. "I'm sitting here, seat 3A. Richard gave a polite chuckle, but his eyes carried no warmth. "Are you sure? Maybe you should double-check with the attendant." Before Naomi could answer, another passenger, a woman draped in a silk scarf, phone held like a stage prop, added her voice. "I think economy is back that way," she said, thumb tilting toward the curtain behind them. Her name was Victoria Crane. The tone in her words wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice. Naomi felt the weight of 24 eyes on her. For a moment, the air thickened, as if the whole cabin was waiting to see how she would respond. Her instinct was to push back. Years of boardroom battles had given her the vocabulary, the posture, the power. but she swallowed it. She reminded herself why she was here, dressed in plain clothes, ticket purchased under a nondescript traveler account. She wanted to see, unfiltered, how passengers like her father might once have been treated, so she simply said, "I'm sure," and slid into 3A. The attendant, Megan Foster, appeared a moment later with a tray of champagne flutes. She moved smoothly down the aisle, offering glasses with a smile to Richard, to Victoria, to the couple across the row. When she reached Naomi, her hand faltered. She looked Naomi up and down, then moved on without a word. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. The sting of being overlooked was familiar, almost dull. But under that dullness was something heavier, something that tightened in her chest. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Its edges were worn, the pages filled with notes, sketches, fragments of speeches. Tucked in the back cover was a folded letter, her father's handwriting, lupin and precise. She traced the edges of the paper, but didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she wrote a single sentence at the top of a blank page. Observed treatment during boarding, not offered service. Her pen hovered there. She thought of her father again, how he had stood outside the chain-link fence of the old Atlanta airfield, telling her, "One day, Naomi, you won't just fly, you'll own the sky." The engines hummed as boarding finished. Passengers buckled in, screens flickered, bags thudded into place. The attendant dimmed the cabin lights, and Naomi felt the aircraft's pulse begin to rise. She closed her notebook gently, her hand lingering on the cover. Somewhere deep inside, between patience and frustration, a whisper of determination stirred. The flight had barely begun. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the cabin eased into its quiet rhythm. A soft chime played overhead, followed by the murmur of passengers reclining their seats, tapping tablets, or flipping through the glossy pages of the in-flight magazine. First class on Orion Airways had been designed for comfort leather seats with generous recline, warm amber lighting, even the faint aroma of citrus in the air vents. But for Naomi Ellison, comfort was nowhere to be found. From her seat in 3A, she felt the silence pressing in. Megan Foster, the lead flight attendant, glided through the aisle with her polished smile, pausing at each row to check belts and offer drinks. Naomi watched as champagne flutes were placed gently into the hands of Richard Holbrook and Victoria Crane. Richard clinked his glass against Victoria's, their laughter spilling like a private joke. Across the aisle, another couple received theirs, complete with a quick remark from Megan about how lovely their trip to Aspen sounded. When Megan reached Naomi, her tray tilted slightly. Naomi caught the hesitation in her eyes, the tiny pause before she angled the tray away and moved on. "Excuse me," Naomi said evenly, keeping her tone polite. "May I have some water?" Megan looked down, then back up, with a smile too tight to be genuine. "I'll circle back," but she didn't. Naomi let her hands rest in her lap. She had endured this theater before the small cuts, the careful omissions. They always claimed it was accidental. The truth was rarely spoken, but it lingered in the air like turbulence you couldn't see but felt in your bones. Richard leaned slightly toward Victoria, his voice low but not low enough. Strange how they let anyone buy a ticket these days. Victoria's laugh tinkled like glass. Maybe there was a discount code? Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise. She opened her leather-bound notebook again, pen sliding across the page, denied basic service, overheard discriminatory remarks. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, every letter an anchor against the tide of emotions tugging at her. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing her mother's voice echo from long ago. Strength isn't always about answering back, Naomi. Sometimes it's about holding the silence until the right words matter. Still, silence had a cost. 2 rows back, a man cleared his throat. His name, as she'd later learn, was Miguel Alvarez, a middle school teacher flying home after visiting his sister. He had watched the exchange, though he stayed quiet, his eyes darting from Megan to Naomi and back again. He shifted in his seat, as if wrestling with whether to intervene. Naomi sensed it, that flicker of decency caught between fear of causing a scene and the pull of doing what was right. She didn't blame him for choosing silence. Most people did. The aircraft climbed smoothly into the stratosphere, engines droning a steady rhythm. Naomi opened the folded letter from her father. The paper was yellowed now, corners creased from years of being read and reread. "My dearest Naomi," it began. "The world won't always welcome you into its cabins with open arms. Sometimes it will tell you you don't belong, but don't let their doubt become your truth. One day, you'll fly higher than any of them can imagine." Her father's words steadied her. She smiled faintly, tucking the letter back into her notebook. When Megan returned with a tray of snacks, small porcelain bowls of warm nuts and olives, she set one down for Richard, then for Victoria, then turned. Naomi straightened, expecting at least the smallest acknowledgement, but Megan passed her by. Again. Victoria tilted her phone slightly, filming herself as she narrated a quick clip for her followers. "Up here in first class, the service is always perfect. Well, almost always." She angled the camera just enough to capture Naomi in the background. Naomi caught the frame and looked away. The cruelty wasn't in the words alone. It was in the smug satisfaction of knowing she was being put on display. Miguel shifted again, this time leaning forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "She hasn't been offered anything." Megan blinked. "Surprised?" "Pardon?" He gestured toward Naomi. "You missed her. Twice." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. A few passengers glanced up from their magazines. Richard rolled his eyes, muttering something Naomi couldn't catch. Megan forced a smile. "Of course. My mistake." She bent down, placing a bowl and a glass of water on Naomi's tray table. Her hands trembled slightly. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice calm. Too calm, perhaps, but the steadiness was intentional. She wouldn't give them the spectacle they expected. Richard leaned closer, his words dripping with derision. "Some people are never satisfied. They get water and still look like they've been wronged." Naomi didn't look at him. She stared instead at the horizon beyond her window, the pale blue sky bending endlessly, indifferent to the squabbles of men and women inside its vessels. She wondered, not for the first time, how many people like her father had sat in these very seats, quiet, unseen, treated as intruders rather than customers. Her notebook lay open on her lap. She added a new line when ignored long enough. Silence becomes louder than any words. The engines roared as the aircraft leveled out. A faint tremor rippled through the cabin, almost imperceptible. But Naomi felt it. She knew the rhythm of planes the way others knew the rhythm of a heartbeat. Something in the vibration felt off. Her pen stilled. She closed her notebook again, folding her hands over it. The cabin seemed to buzz with small talk, laughter, the rustle of newspapers, but underneath it all, Naomi felt the faintest whisper of unease. She reminded herself why she was there, not as CEO, not as owner, but as a witness, to see the cracks in the system not from behind a boardroom table, but from seat 3A, where her father once dreamed of sitting with dignity. The first-class cabin was supposed to symbolize luxury, status, belonging. Instead, it had become a stage where old prejudices performed their tired act. Naomi sat straighter, eyes on the sky outside. The story wasn't finished. The flight had hours to go, and somewhere deep inside, she sensed the silence would not last. Wordlessly, she touched the edge of her father's letter again. Fly higher, it had said she would, but not yet. For now, she let the coldness settle around her, knowing it was only the beginning of what the day would demand. The hum of the engines steadied, a low vibration beneath Naomi Ellison's seat, but her mind drifted far from the polished cabin. She slid the leather-bound notebook onto her lap again and pulled the folded letter from its back pocket. The paper was fragile now, softened by years of being opened and closed, but the ink, her father's strong, looping script, remained as bold as the day he had written it. Naomi, never forget. Dignity doesn't come from the seat they put you in. It comes from the way you carry yourself when they tell you that you don't belong. Her father, Samuel Ellison, had written that line after the day he was forced to walk away from the cockpit he loved. In the 1970s, when airlines were still run on old prejudices, Samuel had been one of the first black pilots in training at a major American carrier. He had studied harder than anyone, memorized every system, flown every simulator hour. Yet, when the final selection came, his name was quietly removed from the roster. They said I didn't have the right look. He had told her once, voice low, as though confessing a sin. She had been just a child, but she could still remember the sting in his eyes. Naomi brushed her thumb over the words and felt her chest tighten. Every time she boarded a plane, she carried Samuel's absence with her. He never flew for the airline that rejected him. Instead, he became a mechanic, working long shifts on the tarmac, wiping oil from his hands before hugging her good night. He never complained, never shouted, but his silence told her more than words ever could. She had vowed then, at 12 years old, that she would finish what he started. That vow had carried her through college, through sleepless years of building Orion Airways, through boardroom battles where men twice her age underestimated her. And it carried her now, sitting in seat 3A while strangers treated her like an intruder. Her eyes blurred. She blinked hard, shutting the letter, slipping it back into the notebook. She would not let the tears win here. Not in this cabin where Richard Holbrook lounged smugly beside his champagne flute. Not where Victoria Crane's phone camera still lingered too close. Instead, she forced herself to look around. The Rouse gleamed with quiet wealth, expensive watches flashing in the dim light, manicured fingers scrolling through stock tickers, conversations about mergers and vacation homes. It was a world her father had been denied, a world that even now questioned her presence. Behind her, she heard the gentle rustle of a page turning. Miguel Alvarez had opened a paperback novel, its spine cracked, the corners bent from use. He looked up briefly, caught Naomi's gaze, and offered a faint smile, not pity, not intrusion, just recognition. She nodded back. It was the first human moment she'd felt since boarding. She leaned her head against the window. Below, the patchwork of Georgia fields blurred into the endless sky. Her mind slipped again into memory. She was 8 years old, sitting on her father's shoulders at the perimeter fence of the old Atlanta airfield. Planes thundered overhead, silver bodies slicing the clouds. Samuel had pointed skyward. "One day, Naomi," he said, "you won't just fly on those, you'll own them." She laughed at the absurdity then. Own the planes, own the sky. But Samuel's voice was steady, certain, as though he could already see the future written in her hands. Naomi smiled faintly at the memory. He had believed in her before she believed in herself. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the transition into cruise. Megan Foster passed through with warm towels, offering them neatly rolled on silver tongs. She placed one into Richard's hands, another to Victoria. When she reached Naomi, her smile faltered. For a moment, Naomi thought Megan would pass again, but perhaps Miguel's earlier words had left an impression, because Megan lowered the tongs stiffly. Naomi accepted the towel with quiet grace. "Thank you," she said. Megan nodded, moving on quickly, her shoulders tense. Naomi unfolded the towel, pressed its warmth against her palms, then against her face. The scent of lemon and cotton drifted up, almost enough to soften the edge of humiliation. Almost. She wondered, briefly, what her father would think if he were here now. Would he tell her to fight back, to stand and demand better? Or would he tell her to hold her silence? As he had so many times before, her thoughts tangled, each answer as unsatisfying as the last. "You write in that notebook a lot," a voice murmured. Naomi turned. Miguel leaned slightly over the aisle, his novel closed in his lap. His tone was cautious, respectful. "I do," she said. "Helps me remember." He nodded. "Teachers do the same. I keep notes about my students, little things you might forget otherwise." She studied him for a moment, the sincerity in his eyes. She felt a flicker of trust, unexpected in this sterile cabin. "Do you always speak up?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "Not always. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I regret it." His eyes dropped to the novel in his hands, but today it felt wrong to say nothing. Naomi's chest warmed. "It matters," she said simply. The engines rumbled deeper, the plane adjusting course. Naomi glanced at the overhead map, the dotted line arcing toward Chicago. Hours still stretched ahead. She closed the notebook and rested it on her lap. For the first time since boarding, she let herself breathe fully. The memory of her father lingered close, but alongside it now was the faint sense of an ally, however small. The sky outside burned orange at the edges as the sun angled west. Naomi's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Strong, steady, unbowed. She whispered under her breath, too soft for anyone to hear, "I'm still here, Daddy," and somewhere, deep in her bones, she felt the echo of his answer. "Keep flying." The cabin settled again, passengers sinking into their private worlds. Richard tapped at his laptop. Victoria rehearsed a new selfie. Megan disappeared behind the curtain, but Naomi sat anchored in her seat, her father's letter close, her notebook ready. She had not yet spoken her truth aloud, but she knew the moment was coming. And when it did, the silence would finally break. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier as the minutes passed, though the temperature remained steady. Naomi Ellison shifted slightly in her seat, sensing something beneath the surface, like a current of unease. Years of running a global company had trained her to read rooms, to sense the unspoken. And here, 35,000 feet in the air, She could feel it again, tension. It began with the subtle way Megan Foster avoided her row. Twice now, the flight attendant had hurried past without making eye contact, as if acknowledging Naomi would undo the fragile order of the cabin. Richard Hallbrook, across the aisle, noticed too, smirking at every omission. He thrived on hierarchies, visible or not, and Naomi could feel his satisfaction radiating like static. She kept her composure. If she spoke too soon, the moment would slip away. If she waited, it might reveal itself. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, low and practiced. "We've been asked to adjust our route slightly due to air traffic congestion near Chicago. Expect a minor delay in arrival." The words seemed innocuous, but Naomi caught something in the tone, tight, hurried, almost rehearsed. She had heard dozens of pilots, hundreds of flights, but this was different. She tucked the detail away, storing it like a chess player noting an opponent's move. Victoria Crane. Phone still clutched in hand, turned dramatically toward Richard. "See, even the flight path is against us," she said with a laugh. Richard raised his glass, "as long as they don't run out of champagne." Naomi turned her gaze to the window. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sky a gradient from pale blue to gold, yet beneath the beauty, she couldn't shake her unease. Miguel Alvarez leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Do you believe him?" Naomi looked at him, surprised. "About the delay, about anything," Miguel replied. His brow furrowed. "I teach kids to trust their instincts. Mine are telling me something's off." Naomi considered him for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Mine too." A sudden clang startled the cabin. A cart had struck the bulkhead, the sound jarring in the quiet. Megan muttered an apology, but her hands shook as she adjusted the tray. Her nerves betrayed her. Richard chuckled. "Careful, sweetheart. Don't spill on the paying customers." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached for her notebook, opened to a clean page, and began to write. Patterns don't lie, tone of captain, behavior of crew, discomfort in passengers. Something not being said. Her pen scratched deliberately, each word a tether to clarity. She paused when she noticed a figure approaching the purser. James Rowland, tall and imposing in his Navy uniform. His presence seemed to command more attention than Megan's. He stopped at Naomi's row, his smile polite, but his eyes cool. "Ma'am," he said, "is everything satisfactory with your service today?" Naomi studied him, catching the hint of dismissal under the courtesy. "I haven't been served," she replied evenly. His brows lifted, just slightly. "I see. I'll address that." He turned, already moving away, the weight of his indifference hanging in the air. Miguel muttered under his breath, "They really want you invisible." Naomi kept her voice calm. Invisible only works until someone decides to look closer. The engines shifted pitch, a deeper thrum vibrating through the floor. Naomi's gaze darted to the map overhead again. Their route had curved sharply, not toward Chicago but veering westward. Her pulse quickened. She pressed the call button above her seat. A chime echoed, soft but insistent. Megan reappeared reluctantly. Yes, she asked. Naomi gestured toward the map. "This isn't a minor adjustment. We're hundreds of miles off course." Megan's expression flickered fear, quickly smothered. "We'll be back en route soon." "Ma'am." "Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about," Naomi repeated, her tone measured. She held Megan's gaze long enough to let the words sink in. Then she leaned back, notebook open, pen poised. Richard snorted. "Leave the flying to the professionals, darling. You're just along for the ride." Naomi turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. "I don't leave my life in the hands of men who hide their mistakes." Her voice was low, but it carried. A ripple of silence followed, even Victoria lowering her phone for once. The hum of the cabin deepened. Naomi's chest tightened, not just from unease, but from memory. She saw her father's hands, grease-stained, tightening a bolt on an engine, whispering under his breath, "Trust the machine, but never trust the men who refuse to admit when it fails." Her pen pressed harder into the paper. "Something is wrong. They know it. We all know it." A turbulence jolt rattled the cabin, sharp enough to knock Richard's glass. Champagne spilled across his shirt, and he cursed loudly. Unbelievable. Can't they keep this thing steady? Miguel steadied his tray table, then looked at Naomi with widened eyes. "This isn't just congestion." Naomi nodded once, firm. "No, it isn't." The intercom chimed again. This time, the captain's voice was tighter, rushed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." Naomi's pulse pounded. She knew turbulence. She knew delays. But she also knew when words were crafted to conceal. And this was concealment. Her mind raced. If her suspicions were correct, the crew was hiding a mechanical issue or an operational misstep. Both could spell danger. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. Fear could spiral into chaos. She needed clarity, strength, presence. She reopened her eyes. The world sharpened. "Miguel," she said softly, "if something happens, don't let them silence what you saw tonight. Write it down. Record it." He frowned. "You speak like you know what's coming." "I've lived long enough to know the signs," she replied. Another jolt, harder this time, sent a tray clattering to the floor. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Megan rushed forward, but her movements lacked coordination, panic fraying her professionalism. Naomi sat steady, notebook open in her lap, her father's letter pressed between the pages. She had no intention of panicking. She had every intention of surviving. The cabin brimmed with tension now, thick and undeniable. The passengers who had ignored her earlier stole glances her way, drawn to the calm she radiated. Richard muttered angrily at his stained shirt, but even his bravado faltered. Victoria's phone shook slightly in her hand. Naomi looked forward, her eyes narrowing on the cockpit door. Whatever was happening behind it, she would know, because secrets, no matter how high in the sky, always had a way of coming down to earth. The cabin lights flickered once, just for a second, but enough to draw startled murmurs. Naomi Ellison straightened in her seat. Her senses sharpened. She'd flown too often, studied too deeply the rhythms of aircraft, not to know the difference between turbulence and technical strain. Something was pressing this flight closer to its limits. James Rowland, the purser, emerged again from behind the curtain. His jaw was tight, his steps brisk, and though he tried to mask it with a polished smile, Naomi could see the tension pulling at the corners of his mouth. He strode down the aisle, pausing at each row with a reassuring nod. But when he reached Naomi's seat, his gaze skimmed past her as if she were still invisible. That, Naomi decided, was the last time she would allow it. She pressed the call button again, firm and deliberate. The chime rang, sharp against the anxious hush. James stopped, turned, and forced his lips into another thin smile. Yes. Ma'am. Naomi gestured toward the overhead screen. The digital map still displayed their westward arc. Why has this aircraft diverted over 500 miles off course without informing us of the actual cause? James's smile stiffened. As the captain stated, it's due to air traffic congestion. Congestion doesn't take you hundreds of miles in the wrong direction. Naomi interrupted, her tone calm but cutting. Her voice carried across the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice now looked up, eyes wide, ears tuned. Richard Halbrook shifted in his seat, sneering. Oh, here we go again. Leave the technical matters to professionals. Sweetheart, you're not in a boardroom now. Naomi turned her head slowly toward him. Richard, even in a boardroom, professionals don't lie about the stakes. They inform, they prepare, and they lead. A murmur of approval rose from somewhere behind her. Miguel Alvarez leaned forward, his voice steady. She's right. We deserve the truth. James's expression faltered. He was losing control of the narrative. His eyes darted toward the cockpit door, then back to Naomi. Ma'am, I must insist you remain calm and trust the crew. Spreading alarm does not help. Naomi's gaze hardened. What spreads alarm is withholding truth from people whose lives depend on it. The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. Victoria Crane, who had been live streaming quietly for her followers, suddenly lifted her phone higher. Her whisper into the camera was audible enough. This is insane. Passengers questioning the crew mid-flight. Yet even her eyes flickered with doubt as she aimed her lens toward the map. Another jolt rattled the cabin, sharper than before. A tray skidded from the galley, crashing to the floor. Gasps erupted, and several passengers clutched their armrests. James barked, louder now. Everyone remained seated. Naomi stayed calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew this was the precipice the moment the story fractured. If she didn't step forward now, chaos would claim the narrative. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she rose smoothly. Gasps rippled again, a mixture of fear and shock at her defiance. James stepped toward her, his hand half raised as though to block her. Sit down immediately, he commanded. Naomi's voice was steady, even serene. No, not until we're given the truth. For the first time, James's mask cracked. A flicker of panic crossed his features. Richard scoffed loudly, trying to reclaim dominance. Oh, for God's sake. She's trying to play hero. Typical, always needing to prove something. Naomi turned, her eyes locking on him with quiet fire. This isn't about proving anything. It's about survival. Do you really think fear makes us safer? Or truth? Her words sliced through his arrogance. Richard opened his mouth to retort, but found none. He slumped back, scowling, though his hands trembled slightly on the armrests. Naomi stepped closer to the aisle, her voice rising just enough for all to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, you have the right to know what's happening on this aircraft. We're far from our stated course. The crew is avoiding our questions. You can stay silent and hope, or you can demand accountability. The silence that followed was thick, charged. Then Miguel spoke up. She's right. We deserve answers. His voice carried conviction, and others nodded, murmuring assent. Even Victoria, though still filming, lowered her phone slightly, caught between spectacle and reality. James's composure frayed. "Enough," he snapped. "Return to your seat now, or I'll have security." He cut himself off, realizing mid-sentence the absurdity of invoking security at 35,000 feet. His slip only amplified Naomi's power. Naomi didn't flinch. "You can't hide behind protocol when lives are at stake. You may outrank me on this flight, Mr. Rowland, but in truth, I outrank you in what matters: integrity, responsibility, and I will not sit down until we hear the truth." A sharp silence filled the cabin, broken only by the drone of engines. All eyes were on Naomi now. She hadn't raised her voice, but her presence commanded every corner of the space. At that moment, the cockpit door cracked open. A sliver of the captain's face appeared, pale and drawn. "James," he called. "Urgent." James hurried forward, blocking the view, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen the fear on the pilot's face. Naomi's voice rang out, calm yet resolute. "There it is. The truth is trying to break through." Gasps, whispers, the sound of doubt turning into collective awareness. Richard shifted uneasily. Victoria's live stream comments scrolled so quickly across her screen she couldn't keep up. James turned back, his voice raised, brittle. "Enough, Ms. Ellison," Naomi said, cutting him off, her tone quiet but sharp as glass. She hadn't planned to reveal her name yet, but the weight of silence demanded it. Naomi Ellison. Recognition flickered in Victoria's eyes. She mouthed the name, then whispered into her phone, "Ellison like Orion Airways." Naomi held her gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. She could feel the ripple spreading through the cabin. Whispers turned to stunned gasps as dots connected. Miguel's eyes widened. "Wait, you own?" Naomi didn't confirm. Not yet. Timing mattered, but she let the silence carry the weight of possibility. James's face drained of color. He realized too late the storm he had walked into. Naomi returned to her seat slowly, deliberately. She buckled her belt, her hands steady. "I've said what I needed to," she told the cabin, her voice carrying. "Now it's your choice whether to demand answers too." The effect was electric. Voices rose, scattered at first, then unified. Passengers calling out, "We want to know the truth. Tell us what's going on. We deserve answers." James tried to hush them, but the tide had turned. The power had shifted. Naomi sat silent, notebook closed on her lap, her father's letter pressed within it. She had lit the spark. Now the fire would spread. The cabin was no longer silent obedience. It was awake. And Naomi knew the breaking point had arrived. The uproar in the cabin did not subside quickly. It swelled, like a wave that had been waiting for the right wind. Passengers who had previously kept their heads down now demanded answers, their voices rising in frustration, in fear, and perhaps most dangerously for the crew in unity. Naomi Ellison sat steady, her hands folded neatly on top of her notebook. She had not raised her voice, but she had shifted the balance of the flight, and though she appeared calm, her pulse thrummed in her ears. She knew this was the moment her father had prepared her for, the moment when dignity meant refusing silence, even if silence was safer. James Rowland returned from the cockpit, his face pale and his polished demeanor worn to its edges. He tried for authority, but his voice cracked at the edges. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. The captain assures me everything is under control." "Under control," someone shouted from behind. "Then why are we hundreds of miles off course?" Why won't you tell us the truth? Another demanded. James faltered, his eyes flickering to Naomi before darting away. She could see it now, fear of exposure, fear of losing the fragile authority he clung to. Naomi unbuckled her belt again, rising to her feet. The motion drew silence, the cabin hanging on her presence. She didn't need to shout. Her voice, low and deliberate, carried further than volume. "My name," she said, "is Naomi Ellison. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Orion Airways." A stunned hush fell over first class. Even Victoria Crane lowered her phone, staring wide-eyed. Richard Halbrook's smirk crumbled, replaced by a frown of disbelief. Miguel Alvarez whispered, almost reverently, "You own this airline?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes, and as the owner of this company, I will not be treated as if my life, or any of yours, is disposable. I demand to know what's happening on this aircraft right now." The words landed like thunder. There was no mistaking them, no brushing them aside. Whispers surged through the rows, disbelief colliding with recognition. Some passengers pulled out their phones, fact-checking, finding Naomi's name linked to headlines, to Forbes profiles, to photographs of her standing in front of Orion Airways jets. James's composure collapsed entirely. His jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed, Ms. Ellison, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," Naomi interrupted, her eyes sharp. "When people are afraid, when trust is broken, that is when truth matters most. If you continue to withhold it, you endanger not only lives but the very foundation of this airline's integrity, and I will not allow that." Her words reverberated through the cabin, settling like iron. She had flipped the power dynamic entirely. Richard shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "This is outrageous," but his voice carried no weight anymore. Even Victoria's camera lens now lingered on Naomi, not him. Naomi took a step into the aisle. "Captain," she called toward the cockpit door, her voice firm, measured. "This is Naomi Ellison, your employer. Open this door, or explain immediately what has placed this flight off course." For a moment, silence. Then the door opened slightly wider, and Captain Harris stepped out. His face was drawn tight, beads of sweat clinging at his temple. His eyes flicked between Naomi, the murmuring passengers, and the crew members frozen in place. "Ms. Ellison," he began, his voice low. "Please, a word in private." "No," Naomi said, her tone unwavering. "You will tell us here. Everyone deserves to know." The captain hesitated, his lips parting, closing again. He looked to James, to Megan, then back to Naomi, the weight of the passenger's eyes pressed against him. Finally, he exhaled. "We lost one of our primary navigation systems 40 minutes ago. The redundancy held for a time. But then we encountered electrical faults. We diverted west to try to avoid heavy traffic zones while we troubleshoot. We are not in immediate danger, but we are vulnerable." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Naomi stayed steady, her voice calm. "Thank you for the truth. That is all anyone wanted." The captain's shoulders sagged with relief, though fear still flickered in his eyes. "We are working the problem. We may need to consider an emergency landing if systems don't stabilize." Naomi inclined her head. "Do it. Safety above all else. But no more lies. This cabin deserves transparency." The captain nodded faintly, retreating toward the cockpit. The door sealed shut again, but the truth had already escaped, impossible to cage. The cabin erupted with voices, some fearful, some relieved, all charged. Naomi raised her hand slightly, and somehow, remarkably, the sound softened. She spoke clearly, each word deliberate. You see, fear thrives in silence, but truth gives us a chance to stand together. This is what leadership means, not hiding, not dismissing, but facing reality with dignity. Her words found their mark. Passengers nodded, murmured agreement. Miguel's eyes shone with quiet admiration. Even Victoria lowered her phone to her lap. Her expression softened from spectacle to sincerity. James stood frozen, his authority stripped bare. Megan shifted beside him, shame written across her face. For the first time since boarding, Naomi saw something like recognition in her eyes, a glimmer of understanding that she had been wrong. Richard, ever stubborn, muttered, "This doesn't change anything. We're still just passengers." Naomi turned to him, her voice gentle but unyielding. "No, Richard, we're not just passengers. We are human beings, equal in dignity, equal in worth. That's what you refuse to see. But perhaps tonight, in the silence of your own fear, you'll remember." Richard had no answer. His eyes dropped to his stained shirt, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of her words. Naomi returned to her seat, fastening her belt. The cabin was no longer filled with blind obedience or simmering prejudice. It was alive, awake, transformed by truth. Miguel leaned toward her, voice low. "You changed the whole flight." Naomi looked out the window, where the sky stretched endlessly, stars beginning to pierce the dark. "No," she said softly, "the truth did. I only gave it permission." The engines hummed, steady but strained. They were not safe yet, but the power had shifted irreversibly. Naomi's secret was no longer a secret, and the world inside that cabin had just learned that the woman they ignored, the woman they dismissed, was the one carrying them all. Her father's words echoed in her chest, steady as the thrum of the plane. Dignity doesn't come from the seat they put you in. It comes from the way you carry yourself when they tell you that you don't belong. Naomi smiled faintly. She belonged here. She had always belonged here, and now, so did the truth. The moment Captain Harris shut the cockpit door, the cabin remained in an uneasy hush. Passengers whispered in clusters, some clutching their phones, others their armrests. Yet one thing had shifted. The silence no longer belonged to fear alone. It was heavy with awareness, threaded with a fragile sense of unity. Naomi Ellison sat upright, her seatbelt fastened, her notebook resting in her lap. She could feel eyes on her from every direction. For years she had commanded boardrooms, auditoriums, global summits, but this, leading a cabin full of anxious strangers at 35,000 feet, felt different. It wasn't strategy or profit margins at stake. It was their lives. Miguel Alvarez leaned toward her. "What happens now?" His voice carried both fear and trust, the kind of trust people offer when they've run out of options. Naomi kept her tone steady. "Now we wait for the crew to do their jobs. But we don't wait in silence. We stay informed, we stay calm, and we keep each other steady." He nodded, almost relieved just to hear the words. A few rows back, Victoria Crane adjusted her phone again, now speaking softly into her live stream. "For those just joining, yes, the Naomi Ellison is on this flight. She owns Orion Airways, and she just forced the truth out of the captain." Her voice trembled slightly, less from drama and more from the weight of reality. Naomi caught her words, but said nothing. She knew the story was already traveling faster than the jet itself. The lights dimmed again as the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. A child whimpered from the economy cabin beyond the curtain. The sound tugged at Naomi's heart, stirring memories of when she was that age, clutching her father's hand at the fence of the Atlanta airfield. Her chest tightened, but she drew in a slow breath, centering herself. She would not let fear spiral. Then the intercom clicked once more. This time, Captain Harris didn't sugarcoat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've assessed the situation. Due to the continuing electrical malfunctions, we are preparing for an emergency landing in St. Louis. The crew will brief you on safety procedures. Please remain calm and follow instructions." Gasps, murmurs, even cries broke out. One passenger shouted, "Emergency landing." Another whispered frantically into a phone, trying to reach loved ones. James Rowland stepped forward, attempting to project command. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, your cooperation is essential. Secure your belongings, fasten your seat belts, and listen carefully to crew instructions." But his voice, stripped of credibility, could no longer soothe. Fear spread like static. Passengers shifted, some arguing, some shaking. Naomi rose once more, ignoring the flicker of panic in James's eyes as she stepped into the aisle. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the clamor. "You are safe as long as you remain calm. Emergency landings are practiced procedures. The crew is trained for this. The best thing we can do is stay steady, support each other, and follow instructions." The tone of her voice, measured, calm, unshakable, settled the cabin more than James's words had. Conversation softened, breathing steadied. Even the child's whimpers hushed as her mother held her tighter, drawing strength from Naomi's certainty. Richard Holbrook's sarcasm faltered entirely now. He muttered under his breath, but no one gave him their attention. The power he thrived on had evaporated. Miguel whispered, "You should be the one with the intercom, not them." Naomi allowed herself a faint smile. Sometimes leadership doesn't need a microphone. The crew, shaken but recognizing her effect, didn't stop her this time. Even Megan Foster, whose avoidance had been palpable, seemed to relax slightly as she prepared the cabin for landing. Naomi sat again, buckling her belt firmly. She pulled her notebook into her lap and opened to a blank page. Her pen moved with steady strokes. Stay calm. Dignity in crisis. The truth steadies fear. Dad was right. Another jolt rattled the cabin, and the lights flickered again. The engines droned with an uneven pitch. Naomi felt her pulse quicken, but refused to let it show. She glanced out the window, dark clouds gathering below, city lights faint in the distance. She closed her eyes briefly. Images of her father flooded her mind, his steady hands, his quiet strength, his unyielding dignity. She whispered under her breath, "I'll finish what you started. Daddy." Her voice was nearly lost to the engines, but in her heart it resounded like a vow. The purser's voice came again, reciting the safety briefing, but now passengers actually listened. Naomi's earlier presence had anchored them, shifting their attention from panic to preparation. They practiced bracing positions, secured bags, and whispered reassurances to each other. Victoria raised her phone once more, but this time her tone was reverent, not mocking. "She's keeping us calm. I can't believe I tried to make fun of her. She's the reason we're not falling apart right now." Naomi caught her words but remained silent. She didn't need recognition. She needed resolve. The captain's voice returned flight attendants. "Prepare the cabin for landing." Naomi felt the descent begin, her body pressing gently against the belt. The hum of the engines shifted, flaps adjusting, the rhythm of the plane changing to something heavier, slower. Whispers filled the cabin again, but they were softer now, almost prayer-like. A man behind Naomi murmured a psalm under his breath. Another passenger kissed a photograph. Miguel sat upright, eyes closed, lips moving silently in what might have been a prayer or simply a plea. Naomi kept her gaze fixed forward, her breathing steady. She didn't pray aloud, but she carried her father's words like scripture. Dignity isn't given, it's carried. The runway lights of St. Louis finally appeared in the distance, glittering faintly through the darkness. Relief rippled through the cabin as passengers craned their necks to see. The intercom clicked again. The captain's voice, firm but still strained brace for landing. The cabin obeyed, heads lowered, arms locked, breaths held. Naomi bent forward, notebook clutched in her hands, her father's letter pressed close to her chest. The plane shuddered as the wheels touched the ground, a violent jolt rattling the cabin. Screams erupted, muffled by bracing positions. The engines roared, brakes screeched, the fuselage groaned under strain. Naomi stayed steady, her body pressed firm, her eyes shut tight. She whispered to herself, "Steady, we are steady." The screeching stretched into eternity before finally, mercifully, the plane slowed, then rolled to a grinding halt. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the cabin exploded in cries, laughter, sobs of relief. Passengers clapped, hugged, shouted. The hum of adrenaline crackled in the air. Naomi sat upright slowly, her breathing steady but her hands trembling slightly as she opened her notebook. She wrote one word in firm, bold letters, "Survived." Miguel turned to her, his eyes wet. "You did it. You kept us together." Naomi shook her head softly. "We did it. Fear divides, but truth unites." Outside the windows, flashing lights of emergency vehicles rushed alongside the plane. The aircraft had stopped, but their journey, Naomi knew, was only just beginning. Her secret was no longer a secret, and the world, already watching through Victoria's live stream and the phones of other passengers, was about to learn what it meant for a black woman, ignored in first class, to reveal she owned the very airline that had carried them through the storm. The cabin door hissed open with a metallic click, and the humid night air of St. Louis swept inside. Blue and red lights pulsed against the windows as emergency vehicles lined the tarmac. Passengers stirred, their faces pale with relief, some streaked with tears. For a moment, no one moved, suspended in the fragile silence that follows survival. Then the first sob broke the stillness. A man clutched his wife, shoulders shaking. A child whimpered, then laughed through tears. Applause erupted, awkward at first, then building until the cabin echoed with clapping. Not the polite applause of landing, but the desperate kind that said, "We made it." Naomi Ellison remained seated, her notebook still in her lap. She allowed herself a single deep breath, then exhaled slowly, steadying. She did not join the applause. She had not carried them for applause. She had carried them because it was necessary. Miguel Alvarez touched her arm lightly. "You saved us," he whispered, eyes still wet. Naomi shook her head. The captain landed the plane. The crew did their jobs. I only reminded everyone to hold steady. Don't downplay it. Miguel pressed gently. "If you hadn't spoken..." Half this cabin would have lost their minds. Naomi offered a faint smile but said nothing more. She knew what she had done, and so did everyone else. As passengers began filing into the aisle, James Rowland's voice trembled through instructions. "Ladies and gentlemen, please deplane calmly. Leave your belongings. Emergency personnel will assist outside." His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow echo of protocol. Megan Foster avoided Naomi's eyes as she passed, but Naomi noticed the faint quiver in her lips, shame, perhaps, or the start of regret. Richard Holbrook muttered curses under his breath as he adjusted his stained shirt, but he didn't sneer now. His arrogance had drained away somewhere between the turbulence and the emergency landing. He shuffled out with the others, invisible for the first time in his own mind. Victoria Crane hesitated in the aisle, phone still clutched in hand, the live stream light glowing faintly. She turned the camera toward Naomi, her voice trembling. "For everyone watching, this woman is Naomi Ellison. She owns Orion Airways. Tonight, she was the one who kept us together." Naomi raised her eyes calmly, meeting the lens without flinching. She didn't pose, didn't dramatize. She simply said, "Dignity isn't about power. It's about presence. Remember that." The chat on Victoria's phone exploded in real-time hearts, shocked emojis, words of awe. Naomi ignored it. She didn't live for comment threads. She lived for truth. Emergency personnel crowded the jet bridge, guiding passengers into the terminal. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed overhead, harsh and sterile after the dim intimacy of the cabin. Families huddled together, some calling loved ones, others still trembling. Naomi stepped into the terminal. Last, reporters had already gathered, tipped off by social media. Microphones jutted forward, cameras flashed. Questions bombarded her. "Ms. Ellison, is it true you revealed yourself mid-flight? Did the crew discriminate against you? How close were you to disaster tonight?" Naomi held up a hand, her voice even. "Everyone is safe. That is what matters tonight. There will be time for questions. There will be accountability. But not here. Not in front of families who just survived an emergency landing." Her words cut through the clamor. Even the reporters fell silent for a beat, struck by her clarity. She turned, guiding a mother with a crying child past the cameras. The reporters parted, reluctantly respectful. Miguel walked beside her, still gripping his worn paperback. "They're going to make you a headline." Naomi glanced at him. "Let them. The story isn't about me. It's about what truth does in the face of fear." Miguel nodded slowly, though awe still lingered in his eyes. They were escorted into a private lounge by airport staff. The room hummed with muted televisions already broadcasting breaking news. Headlines scrolled emergency landing and St. Louis, CEO of Orion Airways on board. Naomi's face filled the screen from a shaky passenger video. Her calm voice ringing out over the chaos. "You have the right to know what's happening." She watched silently. Her own words felt both distant and immediate, like hearing an echo in another person's voice. James entered the lounge, his uniform disheveled. He approached Naomi stiffly. "Ms. Ellison," he faltered, his usual script gone. "I misjudged you. I misjudged everything." Naomi regarded him steadily. "Yes, you did." His mouth opened again, but she raised her hand. "Tonight isn't about your apology. It's about what you do after this. Whether you continue to hide behind protocol or choose integrity, I'll be watching." James swallowed hard, nodding faintly. He turned and left without another word. Megan lingered at the doorway, her hands clasped tightly. She met Naomi's eyes at last. I treated you unfairly. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Her voice cracked on the last word. Naomi studied her, seeing the fear and sincerity mingling. She softened slightly. "You have a chance to learn. Megan, don't waste it. Dignity isn't just for passengers. It's for you, too." Tears welled in Megan's eyes. She nodded quickly. Retreating, Naomi sank into a chair at last, exhaustion pressing into her bones. She opened her notebook, flipping to the page where she had written, "Survived." Under it, she added, "Truth carried us down." Miguel watched her write, then asked quietly, "What happens now?" Naomi closed the notebook with deliberate calm. Now the world knows, and tomorrow, the real work begins. On the television screen, reporters debated, passengers gave interviews, Victoria's live stream replayed, clips spread already, Naomi standing tall in the aisle, her voice unwavering, her name echoing through the cabin. But Naomi wasn't thinking of the cameras. She was thinking of her father, Samuel Ellison, who had once been told he didn't belong in the cockpit, who had carried his dignity even when it was denied him. Tonight, his daughter had carried it further. She whispered under her breath, so soft only she could hear, "We're still flying, Daddy." And she knew this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of what truth, dignity, and presence could build. The morning after the emergency landing, the headquarters of Orion Airways in Chicago buzzed with a nervous energy that pulsed through every corridor. The building's glass facade reflected the dawn, but inside, staff whispered, their eyes darting toward television screens in the lobby, broadcasting the story on repeat. Black woman ignored in first class. Moments later, everyone learns. She owns the airline. The headline that scrolled endlessly across every channel. Naomi Ellison arrived quietly through the back entrance, her leather tote slung over her shoulder, her notebook tucked inside. She wore a navy suit, her hair pulled back neatly, but the faint circles under her eyes betrayed the sleepless night. The board meeting had been called for 9 a.m., and the weight of it pressed on her chest like the lingering cabin pressure from the flight. Security officers opened the elevator doors for her, their nods respectful, their gazes steady. In the ride up, Naomi exhaled deeply and whispered to herself, "Presence. Not anger. Presence." She was not here for vengeance. She was here for truth. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, the boardroom buzzed with tension. 12 directors sat around a long walnut table polished to a mirror shine. At the head sat Charles Latham, the chairman, his silver hair and tailored suit exuding the old-world authority Naomi knew too well. He had once called her a brilliant advisor, but not board material. Now he shifted uneasily as she walked in. "Naomi," he greeted, his voice too smooth. "We appreciate you joining us on such short notice." She placed her notebook on the table before him, not taking the seat offered. "Charles, I didn't join. I called this meeting. Let's be clear on that." A murmur rippled around the table. Some directors glanced at each other, others lowered their eyes. Charles cleared his throat. "Yes, of course. Given the events last night, we felt it prudent to discuss damage control." Damage control, Naomi's voice was calm, but her words cut. Passengers were ignored, mistreated, misled, protocols failed, leadership failed, And yes, some of you would rather bury this under the phrase damage control. But what we face isn't a PR hiccup. It's a crisis of dignity. Her words landed like a gavel strike. One director, Elaine Porter, leaned forward. Naomi, with all respect, we need to think of investors. Stock fell 9% overnight. We have analysts asking for statements. If we don't assure them, Naomi raised her hand. Silence in her. Investors don't leave because of turbulence. They leave because they don't trust leadership to confront truth. The market doesn't fear crisis. It fears denial. The room stilled. Even Elaine leaned back, her argument deflated. Charles tried again. Perhaps we can issue a formal apology from the airline, highlighting the captain's successful landing, the crew's professionalism. Naomi's eyes locked on him. Professionalism. Her voice tightened. A woman threw my luggage down the jet bridge. A lawyer mocked me to my face. A purser treated me like I didn't belong in my own seat. If passengers had not filmed, if I hadn't revealed who I am, do you know what the narrative would be today? That a difficult black woman disrupted a flight. That is what professionalism looks like to you. Silence thickened. She opened her notebook and slid a printed transcript across the table. Screenshots of live stream comments, quotes from passengers, statements spreading like wildfire online. This isn't just my word against theirs. The world saw, and the world is waiting. One of the younger directors, Marcus Lee, cleared his throat. "What do you propose?" Naomi looked at him, then scanned the room. She had waited for this question. We don't issue a hollow apology. We don't hide behind protocol. We lead. We acknowledge systemic bias exists in our cabins. We acknowledge passengers of color have long been made to feel unwelcome in first class, and we announce reforms that set a new standard in aviation. Charles's jaw tightened. Naomi, be reasonable. Acknowledging systemic bias, do you realize the legal exposure that creates? Do you realize the moral bankruptcy of ignoring it? She countered, steady but fierce. This company was built to fly people, not status. My father died believing he didn't belong in the cockpit because of his skin color. I refuse to let another generation of passengers feel they don't belong in their seat because of theirs. Her voice trembled at the edge, but she did not let it break. Elaine shifted uncomfortably. Marcus Lee leaned forward again. What reforms? Naomi flipped open her notebook. Pages of handwritten notes, bullet points circled in blue ink. First, mandatory anti-bias and dignity training for every employee, from gate agents to executives, within 90 days. Second, establish an independent passenger advocate office with real authority to investigate complaints. Third, zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, enforced with immediate suspension pending investigation. Fourth, publish quarterly transparency reports, complaints, resolutions, disciplinary actions. Fifth, create the Ellison Fellowship, scholarships for underrepresented young people to pursue aviation careers. The directors exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked impressed, others looked threatened. Charles scoffed softly. That's a tall order, and costly. Naomi met his eyes without flinching. Costly is silence. Costly is lawsuits. Costly is another viral video where we look away from bias. Integrity pays dividends. Dignity is profit. Her words lingered, heavy and undeniable. At the far end of the table, Helen Vance, the COO, finally spoke. She had remained quiet until now, her sharp eyes watching Naomi carefully. She's right. All eyes turned. Helen folded her hands. Last night wasn't a coincidence. It was a mirror. If we ignore what it reflected, we deserve to collapse. Investors don't want spin. They want leadership. Naomi's plan is leadership. The room fractured, half leaning toward Naomi, half resisting. Charles tried one last time. Naomi, we can't let one dramatic incident dictate the future of this airline. Naomi leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't one incident. It was every ignored passenger who never went viral. It was every story silenced before it reached this table. Last night was only the one you couldn't bury. And if you think dignity is negotiable, then you don't belong in this seat. Her words froze Charles in place. The silence stretched until Marcus Lee spoke again, his voice steady. I vote we adopt Naomi's reforms, one by one. Hands began to rise, some slowly, some firmly. Elaine hesitated, then raised hers. Helen raised hers without hesitation. Charles's hand stayed flat on the table, jaw clenched, face pale, but he was outnumbered. Naomi inhaled, then exhaled. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't gloating. She was steady, present. Then it's decided, she said softly. As the board adjourned, reporters outside clamored for statements, cameras waited, investors hovered. The world held its breath. Naomi gathered her notebook, feeling the familiar weight of it against her palm. She whispered inwardly, like a prayer to her father. We did not beg for a seat. We built the airline. And, as she stepped toward the waiting microphones, she knew this was not just about Orion Airways. It was about every seat denied, every voice silenced, every dignity ignored. Tonight, the reckoning began. By the following week, the name Naomi Ellison was etched into every headline across the country. News anchors replayed passenger footage from Flight 2273 in endless loops, Naomi standing calm and tall in the aisle, speaking to frightened passengers, then revealing who she was. The narrative fractured the nation into two camps, those who praised her composure and courage, and those who questioned whether she had staged the moment. Morning talk shows hosted panels of aviation experts, most of whom looked uncomfortable when asked why such discrimination persisted in 2025. Hashtags trended globally. Jadon She Owns, the airline, Jew dignity first. Orion Reckoning, late-night comedians joked. Imagine telling your boss's boss's boss she doesn't belong, then finding out she literally owns the plane you're on. The audience laughed, but beneath the humor was an unease that couldn't be brushed off. In St. Louis, the passengers who had been on the flight became unwilling celebrities. Victoria Crane gave an interview on national television, her blonde hair still perfectly styled, but her voice faltering. I was live streaming because I thought it would be a spectacle, she admitted. But what I captured was someone showing us what true leadership looks like. I mocked her at first, and then I realized I was watching a woman hold us all together when even the crew faltered. The clip of Victoria's confession went viral nearly as quickly as Naomi's calm command from the aisle. Social media users flooded her comments, some forgiving, some condemning, but all captivated. Richard Hallbrook, the once arrogant lawyer, wasn't so lucky. Passenger videos of his sneering remarks and dismissive laughter spread like wildfire. His law firm released a terse statement distancing themselves. We do not condone or tolerate discriminatory behavior. Within 48 hours, he had been asked to resign. Tabloids ran photos of him leaving his downtown office with a cardboard box in his hands. For once, his smirk was gone. Meanwhile, Megan Foster wrestled with her conscience. She had been the one to dismiss Naomi in first class, to look past her dignity. When the airline announced Naomi's reforms, Megan requested to speak on camera. Tears glistened in her eyes as she told her story. I failed in my duty. I let bias dictate my service. I almost cost my airline more than money. I almost cost it its soul. I am grateful Ellison chose to see me as someone who can learn instead of someone to discard. I intend to prove she was right. The interview resonated. Some viewers doubted her sincerity, but many saw in her a reflection of their own blind spots. Comments poured in. That could have been me. That has been me. I need to do better. Miguel Alvarez, the quiet teacher who had sat beside Naomi, became a folk hero of sorts. Journalists loved his everyman perspective, his well-worn paperbacks, his soft-spoken awe. On camera, he said, Naomi didn't just keep us calm. She reminded us we matter, even when the people in charge wanted us to feel small. That's not just leadership. That's humanity. Miguel's words were quoted on protest signs, printed on T-shirts, and repeated in classrooms where students debated dignity and leadership. His school in Albuquerque received letters from across the country thanking him for speaking truth so simply. In Chicago, Naomi faced the storm with her characteristic calm. She attended press conferences not with the bluster of a defensive executive, but with the presence of someone who had nothing to hide. This isn't about one flight, she told a packed room of journalists. It's about every person who has been told, in ways big or small, that they don't belong where they've rightfully earned a seat. Orion Airways will not only admit its failures, we will build systems to make sure dignity isn't optional. Her words rippled outward. Civil rights leaders praised her candor. Advocacy groups demanded other airlines adopt similar reforms. Stock analysts initially panicked at the turbulence in Orion's share price, but within days, it rebounded as passengers booked flights in solidarity. Customers wanted to fly with the airline whose CEO spoke like a human being rather than a corporation. Still, backlash simmered. On certain networks, commentators derided Naomi as overdramatic or accused her of weaponizing identity. Hashtags like "Not My Airline" surfaced, though they never gained the same traction as she owns the airline. Charles Latham, the chairman Naomi had outmaneuvered, was rumored to be quietly courting allies to undermine her reforms. But each time he appeared on screen, his dismissive tone only strengthened Naomi's case in the eyes of the public. In the streets of Atlanta, Dallas, and New York, rallies formed. People carried cardboard cutouts of airplane seats painted with slogans, "This seat is ours," "Dignity first," "No more flying." While black, for many, the story wasn't just about Naomi, it was about them. It was about years of being overlooked, ignored, or humiliated in quiet, unrecorded moments. Naomi's story had cracked the silence wide open. Naomi herself refused to bask in celebrity. In interviews, she spoke of her father, Samuel Ellison. He was told he couldn't be a pilot because of his skin. He died never knowing his daughter would own an airline. I carry him with me into every room, every board meeting, every cabin aisle. Last week, when turbulence shook us, I thought of him. I thought dignity doesn't disappear in storms. It becomes more necessary. Her words brought anchors to tears. One news host, voice breaking, said, "For every black parent who told their child, you may have to be twice as good to get half as far." Naomi Ellison just rewrote that equation. Inside Orion's headquarters, employees buzzed with a mix of pride and anxiety. Some feared the reforms would upend routines. Others felt emboldened. A young gate agent in Denver emailed Naomi directly, "Thank you for saying out loud what we've whispered for years. Now we know someone's listening." Naomi read every letter. She underlined phrases in her notebook: listening, presence, truth. Each word became a thread weaving into the larger fabric of change she envisioned. But even in the swell of support, Naomi felt the strain. Late at night, alone in her apartment overlooking the Chicago River, she stared out at the city lights and let herself feel the exhaustion. She replayed the sneers, the dismissals, the turbulence shaking the plane. She whispered again to her father's memory. "I carried them down. Daddy, but who carries me?" Her own doubt was real, her fatigue heavy. Yet each morning, she rose, put on her navy suit, and faced the cameras again, because she knew this was bigger than her. The public storm showed no signs of calming, but for the first time, Naomi felt the wind at her back rather than in her face. The reckoning had begun, and the world was watching to see if Orion would rise or fall. The first Monday of Orion Airways' reform rollout began not with a press conference but with a training room. Naomi Ellison believed change could not start from a podium. It had to begin where habits lived inside the daily rhythm of employees who met passengers face to face. In a brightly lit conference hall at the Chicago headquarters, nearly 200 gate agents, flight attendants, and supervisors gathered. Some shuffled nervously, others crossed their arms in quiet resistance. Posters on the walls read, "Dignity is non-negotiable, and every seat belongs to someone who earned it." Naomi entered quietly. No entourage, no podium. She stood in the center of the room and let the chatter fade on its own. When silence fell, she spoke softly but clearly. "I will not lecture you today. I will listen. Tell me what dignity has meant or hasn't meant in your job." At first, no one moved. Then a young agent in a Navy vest raised her hand. "My name's Erica Chen, Denver Station. Sometimes I feel pressured to move passengers around based on who looks more important. I know it's wrong, but the culture makes it feel normal." Naomi nodded, writing the words pressure and culture in her notebook. "Thank you. Erica, you've named the truth. Normal isn't always right." A veteran flight attendant spoke next, his voice low. "I've seen colleagues ignore certain passengers because they assumed those folks didn't belong. I stayed quiet because speaking up meant conflict. I regret that." Naomi underlined silence. Then she looked around the room. Silence is also a decision. But here, starting today, silence will no longer protect anyone. We will create channels where your voice is a safeguard, not a liability. Applause broke out, not thunderous, but steady. It was a beginning. By midweek, the Dignity training modules were underway across hubs from Atlanta to Los Angeles. Sessions combined role plays, history lessons on bias in aviation, and testimonials from passengers who had faced discrimination. Some employees rolled their eyes, others leaned in with genuine hunger to learn. Naomi attended sessions incognito when she could, sitting in the back, listening more than speaking. The heart of the reforms, however, was the passenger advocate office. Naomi appointed Miguel Alvarez as its first director, a move that shocked the board but delighted employees. When asked why she chose a teacher with no corporate background, Naomi replied simply, "Because he knows how to listen, how to hold space, and how to remind people they matter, skills we desperately need." Miguel accepted humbly, his worn paperback still in his briefcase even during his first day at HQ. His office door stayed open, and within hours, employees and passengers alike began emailing him stories, some painful, some hopeful. He responded to every one. Meanwhile, quarterly transparency reports were drafted for the first time. Orion Airways would publish data on complaints, disciplinary actions, and resolutions. Charles Latham fought the idea bitterly in private, warning of lawsuits and public backlash. But Naomi countered. Sunlight doesn't destroy integrity. It reveals it. If we can't stand transparency, we don't deserve trust. The board voted narrowly in her favor, Helen Vance standing firmly at her side. As reforms rolled out, backlash from certain corners grew sharper. A group of senior pilots circulated anonymous memos complaining that social justice experiments were distracting from operational excellence. One memo read, "Airlines run on discipline, not feelings." Naomi read it, drew a small circle around the phrase, and wrote beneath it, "Discipline without dignity is control, not leadership." She sent the memo back with her note attached. It spread through internal emails, sparking debate. Megan Foster, determined to prove her apology was more than words, volunteered for every training session. In one role-play exercise, she found herself seated in a mock cabin opposite a black woman cast as a passenger. The trainer instructed her to practice dignified engagement. Megan's throat tightened. She looked into the woman's eyes and whispered, "I see you. You belong here." The trainer nodded. Megan exhaled shakily. For the first time, she believed her own words. Passengers began noticing changes within weeks. In Orlando, a grandmother traveling with her grandson emailed Orion to say, "For the first time, no one looked twice at our tickets. They smiled. They welcomed us like we were meant to be there." I cried, not because of pain, but because of relief. Naomi read the email aloud during a staff meeting, her voice trembling slightly. "This," she said, "is the dividend of dignity." Reporters who had once doubted her reforms now requested access to cover training sessions and interview employees. News stories shifted tone from turbulence to transformation. Orion Airways charts a new course, but not every headline was glowing. Conservative outlets painted Naomi as a CEO more concerned with feelings than profits. Stock tickers flashed warnings of instability. Charles Latham quietly gathered allies, hinting at a vote of no confidence. Naomi anticipated it. She spent late nights in her office overlooking the Chicago skyline, scribbling contingency plans in her notebook. One evening, Helen Vance joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one beside Naomi. "You know they'll try to force you out if this gets any harder." Naomi closed her notebook, exhaustion shadowing her face. "I know, but I didn't come this far to leave dignity half-built." Helen studied her for a long moment. "You remind me of your father. He had that same fire, the one they couldn't put out." Naomi's eyes softened. "He carried it, even when no one saw. I carry it because now the world must." The weeks unfolded with both friction and breakthroughs. Complaints dropped sharply in pilot programs where reforms were fully implemented. Passenger satisfaction rose. Employees, once skeptical, began volunteering for leadership roles in the new system. In Los Angeles, Naomi attended the graduation of the first class of Ellison Fellows' 20 young students of color who received scholarships to pursue aviation careers. One of them, an 18-year-old named Jasmine Brooks, told the crowd, "I didn't think flying was for people like me. Now I know I can belong in the cockpit, not just the cabin." Naomi clapped until her palms ached. her heart swelling with quiet pride. By the end of the quarter, Orion's first transparency report went public. It showed 342 complaints investigated, 29 employees disciplined, 14 terminated for gross misconduct. The report sparked outrage in some quarters, but admiration in many more. They're finally telling the truth. A consumer advocate said on live television, "That's worth more than empty apologies." Naomi knew it was only the beginning. The system still resisted. Storms still brewed, and power still bristled at accountability. But the roots of reform had been planted, and they were already breaking through the old ground. One evening, standing by her office window, Naomi flipped open her notebook. Beneath all the scribbled reforms, she wrote a single sentence in bold strokes. "We are not here to control the skies. We are here to carry dignity across them." She closed the notebook with steady hands. Tomorrow would bring new battles. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, and somewhere deep inside, she felt her father's presence again, steady, quiet, proud. The decisive moment arrived on a rainy Thursday in Chicago. The board of Orion Airways had called a special session. Its agenda leaked to the press hours earlier. Headlines buzzed, "Vote of no confidence. Looms over CEO Naomi Ellison." The rumor was that Charles Latham had gathered enough allies to push her out. Outside headquarters, crowds swelled under umbrellas. Some carried signs in support, "Stand with Naomi, dignity flies with her." Others shouted angrily, accusing her of politicizing aviation. The air was thick with anticipation, thunder rolling faintly in the distance. Naomi Ellison walked through the lobby, flanked not by security but by employees, flight attendants, gate agents, and mechanics who had volunteered to accompany her inside. Megan Foster was among them. Her uniform pressed, her expression resolute. Erica Chen clutched a folder of testimonials from passengers who had felt the reforms firsthand. Miguel Alvarez carried nothing but his ever-present paperback, its cover damp with rain. When Naomi entered the boardroom, Charles Latham was already seated at the head, his silver hair slicked back, his eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "Ms. Ellison," he said smoothly, "today the board will decide whether your leadership remains in the best interest of Orion Airways." Naomi placed her notebook on the table. She did not sit. "No. Charles, today the board will decide whether dignity is negotiable." The directors shifted uneasily. Reporters had been granted limited access, their cameras discreet but present. The world was watching. Charles launched into a speech about instability, stock fluctuations, investor unease. He painted Naomi as reckless, a leader too focused on emotions and appearances. His words were polished, but his tone was sharp, almost desperate. When he finished, Naomi opened her notebook. She spoke with the steady cadence that had carried passengers through turbulence. "Let's look at the facts. Since the reforms began, complaints of discriminatory behavior dropped 37%. Passenger satisfaction rose 22%. Our transparency report was downloaded more than any annual report in company history. People are booking flights not in spite of our honesty, but because of it." She turned a page, her pen tapping lightly. "And here are the voices you won't find in stock charts. A grandmother in Orlando who cried because she was finally treated like she belonged. A student in Los Angeles who now believes she can be a pilot. A mechanic in Dallas who told me, 'For the first time, I feel proud to wear this badge. This is not chaos. This is leadership. Miguel stepped forward then, offering the board a stack of printed letters. These are from passengers and employees. They don't see Ms. Ellison as reckless. They see her as the reason they still believe in this airline. Reporters scribbled furiously as directors flipped through the letters, their brows furrowed. Charles's jaw tightened. Touching stories, but leadership requires numbers, not sentiment. Naomi met his gaze. Numbers are what you hide behind when you don't want to face people. Sentiment is what keeps them coming back when numbers fail. The room was silent except for the rain tapping the windows. Finally, Helen Vance rose. "I move that we vote. But let's not pretend we're voting on one woman. We're voting on whether Orion Airways belongs to the past or the future." The vote began. Hands raised, one by one. At first, Charles seemed confident, 2, 3, 4 in his favor. Then Marcus Lee raised his hand for Naomi. Elaine Porter followed. Helen, of course, already stood with her. When the count finished, Naomi had won by a single vote. Charles's face drained of color. The reporters leaned forward, capturing every flicker of emotion. Naomi inhaled slowly. She did not smile, did not gloat. She simply said, "Then Orion Airways will continue its course." Charles slammed his folder shut. "This isn't over," he muttered. But the room knew otherwise. His power had fractured. After the meeting, Naomi stepped into the lobby where employees and protesters still waited. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward. The noise swelled until she lifted her hand. The crowd quieted almost instantly. Her voice carried through the atrium, steady and warm. "Last night, you wondered if dignity had a place in the skies. Today, this board affirmed that it does. But this isn't my victory. It belongs to every passenger who has ever felt unseen, and every employee who chooses to serve with respect. We will stumble. We will face storms, but we will not turn back. Because every seat on every flight belongs to someone who earned it, and every soul deserves to fly with dignity." The atrium erupted in applause. Some wept openly. Others raised their phones high, streaming the moment live. Naomi stood still, her presence anchoring the room. That night, in the quiet of her office, Naomi opened her notebook once more. She wrote a single word, legacy. Beneath it, she scribbled, not power, not profit, presence. Weeks later, Orion Airways unveiled its new slogan, "Where Everyone Belongs." Billboards stretched across highways, showing passengers of every background smiling in their seats. But it wasn't the marketing that mattered. It was the subtle changes passengers felt in the small moments, a greeting without judgment, an upgrade without suspicion, a flight where belonging was no longer questioned. Megan became a trainer for new hires, telling her story not as a polished script but as a raw confession of her failure and growth. Erica Chen was promoted to lead a regional station, her courage recognized. Miguel's passenger advocate office expanded, fielding thousands of calls and emails with patience and humanity. Charles Latham resigned quietly months later, citing health reasons. Few believed him, but fewer cared. The airline moved on. Naomi received invitations to speak at universities, summits, even Capitol Hill hearings on corporate accountability. Yet she often declined, preferring to sit in training rooms to listen to new employees practicing dignity in real time. On the anniversary of Flight 12273, a commemorative plaque was unveiled at St. Louis Airport. It read, "On this site, passengers and crew faced fear together. Here, dignity held steady. dedicated to every traveler who has ever been told they don't belong. Naomi stood before it with her employees, her hand resting lightly on the cold metal. A little boy tugged at her sleeve Jasmine Brooks' younger brother, Ms. Ellison. "Are you really the boss of all the planes?" Naomi knelt to his level, smiling softly. "I don't own the planes," she said. "I carry the people." The boy grinned, satisfied. As she rose, Naomi felt her father's presence again, steady and proud. The skies were not free of storms, but they were freer than before. And as long as she carried truth with her, she knew the airline would endure. That night, she added one final note to her notebook. Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves. It's what we leave in others. And with that, Naomi closed the book not because the story was over, but because it had taken flight. At its heart, this story is not simply about an airline, it is about the quiet strength we all carry when our dignity is tested. Life often places us in situations where we are overlooked, doubted, or even disrespected, regardless of what we have achieved. The lesson here is clear: our value does not diminish because others fail to recognize it. For many older viewers, this resonates deeply. You may remember times when your hard work was dismissed, or your voice was set aside, even after years of experience and contribution. But like Naomi Ellison in the story, you have the right to stand firm, not with anger, but with presence, with truth, with the confidence of what you've built through a lifetime of perseverance. The message is timeless. Dignity is not granted by others. It is something we carry within ourselves. And when we choose to stand in that truth, we do more than protect our own worth. We inspire the next generation to believe that respect is non-negotiable. So, let this story remind us all your life, your legacy, and your voice still matter, always. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that inspire and uplift. Your support means everything, and together we can keep these voices alive.